He called losing you an upgrade. But when his new woman finally found you, she didn't see the woman he left behind. She saw the truth he was desperate to hide. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that doesn't just break your heart. It attacks your sense of worth. It happens when someone you built a life with looks at you and decides that someone else is better. You start asking questions you never thought you'd ask. Was I not beautiful enough? Was I too difficult? Did I stop being interesting? Was there something wrong with me? And if you're not careful, his decision becomes your identity. You begin measuring yourself against the woman he chose, her appearance, her confidence, her age, her personality, her everything. And suddenly you are standing in front of a mirror trying to find the flaw that supposedly made you replaceable. But listen to me carefully. You were not replaced because you lacked value. You were abandoned by someone who decided that novelty was more exciting than commitment. There's a difference. Sometimes people don't leave because you became less worthy. They leave because they became less capable of appreciating what was already in their hands. And my husband thought he had made the perfect decision. He thought walking away from me meant moving upward. He called her his dream woman. He looked at me with the cold confidence of someone who believed I would eventually understand that he had upgraded. But he had no idea what was coming, because the woman he chose was about to meet the woman he underestimated. And that meeting would change everything. He didn't just leave me. He made sure I knew why. That was the part that hurt. If he had simply said, I'm unhappy, maybe I could have grieved the marriage and eventually made peace with the ending. But he wanted me to believe that another woman had proven something about me. She was more exciting, more elegant, more confident, more everything. At least that was the story he told himself. And when someone leaves you while comparing you to the person they're choosing, you can spend years trying to win a competition you never agreed to enter. I remember looking at her photograph. I studied everything. Her smile, her clothes, her hair, the way she carried herself. And I hated myself for doing it because every comparison felt like another tiny betrayal against my own heart. I wondered, what does she have that I don't? But eventually, I asked a better question. Why did I ever believe his preference was a measurement of my worth? That question changed something inside me. Because love is not a beauty contest. Marriage is not an audition. And your value does not decrease because someone else receives the attention you once received. My husband was convinced he had found perfection. He spoke about her as if she had been created specifically to prove that leaving me was the right decision. And I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, because I was beginning to understand something he hadn't. People can fall in love with an image. They can worship an illusion. They can mistake excitement for compatibility. But eventually, reality walks through the door. And when reality arrived for his new woman, she didn't meet the man I once loved. She met the truth I had already survived. And that truth was waiting for her. The message came when I least expected it. A simple sentence, can we talk, it was from her. His dream woman, the woman he had chosen over me. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My hands were still, but my heart wasn't. Because there are some messages that carry more weight than the words inside them. I knew this wasn't curiosity. Something had happened. She had discovered something. And suddenly, all those questions I had buried came rushing back. What does she want from me? Does she want to brag? She want answers. Does she want to tell me that he really is happier without me? Part of me wanted to ignore her. Another part of me wanted to finally ask everything I had been too heartbroken to ask my husband. So I agreed to meet. When I saw her walking toward me, something unexpected happened. She didn't look victorious. She didn't look smug. She looked nervous. Actually, she looked frightened. And I realized something immediately. She wasn't meeting the bitter ex-wife she had probably imagined. She was meeting the woman who had already lived through the part of the story she was only beginning to understand. She sat across from me and didn't say anything for several seconds. Then she whispered, I didn't know, 3 words. But they carried an entire storm. I didn't ask, I didn't know what I already understood, because sometimes you can hear the truth in someone's silence before they have the courage to speak it. She looked at me differently now, not like competition, not like the woman who had lost, but like someone standing at the edge of a truth she couldn't unsee. And then she reached into her bag. She placed something on the table between us. What I saw next made my entire body go cold. She placed the phone on the table. There were messages on the screen, messages from my husband, but they weren't messages I expected to see. She told me she had started noticing inconsistencies, little things, promises that didn't match reality, stories that changed depending on who was listening. And the same charming confidence he once used to convince me that everything was my fault was beginning to crack. She looked at me and said, "He told me you were the reason the marriage failed." I nodded, because I had heard that story before. He had told her I was difficult, too emotional, too demanding, impossible to please. He had painted himself as the exhausted husband who had finally escaped a woman who didn't appreciate him, and she believed him. Why wouldn't she when someone tells a story with enough confidence? We sometimes mistake confidence for truth. But then she discovered something. He had been telling her the same promises he once made to me, the same future, the same words, the same excuses, even the same little phrases that had once made me feel special. She said, "I realized I wasn't his dream, I was his escape." And that sentence stayed with me, because sometimes people don't choose another person because that person is extraordinary. Sometimes they choose another person because they are desperate to avoid confronting themselves. My husband didn't suddenly become a better man when he met her. He simply carried the same unresolved patterns into a new relationship. And now she was seeing what I had spent years explaining. But I didn't feel victorious. That surprised me. I didn't want her relationship to collapse, just so mine would feel justified. I wanted something much deeper. I wanted her to understand that none of this was about two women competing for one man's approval. It was about two women realizing that a man's inability to love honestly does not define either woman's worth. She looked at me and asked one question. "How did you survive this?" And for the first time, I knew exactly what I needed to tell her. "How did you survive this?" Her question broke something open inside me. Not because I didn't know the answer, because I finally understood how long I had been waiting for someone else to give me permission to heal. I looked at her and said, "I stopped blaming myself for someone else's choices." It sounds simple, it isn't. When someone leaves you for another person, your mind becomes cruel. You replay conversations, you examine photographs, you remember every argument. You wonder which version of yourself might have prevented the ending. You start thinking, if I had been softer, prettier, quieter, more exciting, maybe he would have stayed. But that kind of thinking can become a prison because you are trying to rewrite the past with a version of yourself that never existed. I spent months believing I had failed at being a wife. Then I realized something painful. I had been so busy trying to become lovable enough for him that I had forgotten and I was already worthy of love. I had confused being chosen with being valuable. Those are not the same thing. Someone can choose you and still mistreat you. Someone can desire you and still disrespect you. Someone can leave you and still be the person who made the wrong choice. Your worth was never placed in their hands. I told her that healing didn't begin when I stopped loving him. Healing began when I stopped abandoning myself. That was the real betrayal I had to confront. Not his affair, not his new relationship, not even the humiliation of being replaced. It was the way I had started seeing myself through his eyes. So I began again, quietly. I rebuilt my confidence. I made decisions without asking whether he would approve. I learned to enjoy my own company. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, I became someone I hadn't realized I had lost. My husband thought losing me was his upgrade. He never imagined I would become unrecognizable without him. She listened without interrupting. Then she looked down at the table and said, "He told me you were jealous of me." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. That was his favorite trick. Take the consequence of his behavior and make it look like someone else's insecurity. If I questioned him, I was controlling. If I noticed contradictions, I was paranoid. If I cried, I was dramatic. If I became quiet, I was punishing him. He always had a label ready. And labels are powerful when you're already doubting yourself. They make you question your own reality. But she was beginning to recognize the pattern. She told me that whenever she confronted him, he didn't answer the question. He changed the subject. He became angry. And somehow she ended up apologizing. That was when I looked directly into her eyes and said, please don't make the mistake of thinking you have to earn peace from someone who keeps creating chaos. She started crying, and I understood why. Because there is a moment in every unhealthy relationship when you realize you're exhausted from defending your right to have feelings. You're exhausted from explaining basic respect. You're exhausted from asking for honesty as though honesty is some extraordinary favor. I didn't tell her to leave him. That decision had to be hers. I didn't want revenge. I wanted freedom. And freedom doesn't require you to destroy the person who hurt you. Sometimes freedom is simply refusing to carry their version of you anymore. She looked at me and whispered, I thought I was the woman he finally changed for. I said, maybe that's what he wanted you to believe. Then I paused, because there was something she needed to hear. You cannot love someone into becoming the person they pretend to be. And the moment you stop confusing potential with reality, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. She wiped her tears. Then she asked me something that made my heart ache. Did he ever really love you? Did he ever really love you? That question stayed between us. And for a few seconds, I couldn't answer. Because that's the cruelest question heartbreak leaves behind. Not why did he leave? Not who was she, but was any of it ever real? I wanted to give her a simple answer, yes or no. But life isn't always that clean. I believe he loved me in the ways he was capable of loving. There were beautiful moments. There were nights when we laughed until we couldn't breathe. There were promises I believed. There were memories I will never pretend didn't matter. But love without honesty becomes dangerous. Love without respect becomes exhausting. And love without accountability can slowly destroy the person who keeps trying to save it. I told her maybe he loved me. But he also loved the version of himself he got to be when I kept forgiving him. That was the truth I had to accept. Sometimes people don't want to lose you. They just don't want to change for you. They want your loyalty without earning it, your forgiveness without accountability, your patience without giving you peace, your heart without taking responsibility for what they do with it. And eventually, you have to stop asking whether they loved you enough. You have to ask whether the relationship was healthy enough for you to remain inside it. Those are completely different questions. She sat quietly. I could see something changing in her face. She wasn't looking at me anymore as the woman who had been replaced. She was looking at me as someone who had walked through fire and refused to become fire. And suddenly, I felt no anger toward her. She wasn't my enemy. She was another woman standing at the beginning of a painful realization. I reached across the table and held her hand. I said, don't compete with the woman he left. And don't become the woman he wants you to be. Become the woman you can respect when you look in the mirror. Her eyes filled with tears. And then she showed me one final message. This time, my husband's name was on the screen. I looked at the message on her phone, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no jealousy, no desire to prove myself, just peace. My husband had spent so much time convincing everyone that leaving me was his greatest decision. He wanted people to believe he had upgraded, that I was the woman who couldn't keep him, that she was the woman who finally gave him everything I couldn't. But standing there, I realized something. I was never the loss. I was simply the person he lost because he couldn't recognize what he had. And that's a painful truth, but it's also a freeing one. Sometimes the person who walks away thinks they're walking towards something better. And sometimes they are. But sometimes they're only running away from the responsibility of becoming better themselves. My new life didn't begin when he left. It began when I stopped waiting for him to regret leaving. That was my freedom. I no longer needed his apology. I no longer needed his new relationship to fail. I no longer needed his new woman to admit that I had been right. I didn't need revenge. I needed myself back. And when she finally walked away from that table, I watched her disappear into the crowd. I didn't know what choice she would make. But I knew mine. I would never again beg someone to recognize my worth, because the right people don't require you to shrink so they can feel bigger. The right people don't make you compete for basic respect. And the right people don't call losing you an upgrade. So if someone has ever made you feel replaceable, remember this: being abandoned does not mean you were worthless. Sometimes it means you finally got released from a place where your worth was constantly being questioned. He thought losing me was an upgrade. But the greatest upgrade wasn't the woman he found. It was the woman I became after I finally found myself. And that woman, she was never replaceable.